So good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our third and final day of the Water, Soil, Climate workshop. We're so happy you could join us, and great to see people coming back for the third day. And I'm Shauna McKinnon. I'm the network manager for the BC Agricultural Climate Action Research Network. I'm going to be moderating for today's session. I'm hosting the session from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, from where I live in Vancouver. I've been so enjoying the presentations and the discussions so far this week. We had some great conversations yesterday about water and, lots of great conversation the first day around regional extension and tools to support farmers dealing with climate change. So for today, we are focusing on soil this morning. And during our first two sessions, so the first one this morning, we are going to be hearing about on-farm trials, looking at different nutrient management and cover cropping practices on organic farms. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers in just a moment here. After a short break, we're going to have a panel session that's going to be focusing on different cover crop programs that are out there to support farmers to implement these practices on their farms. And then we're going to end the morning with a session that will be where we have three guests coming from the BC Institute of Agrologists, the BC Centre for Agritech Innovation, and the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food. And these three groups are all going to be talking about career and training opportunities in the agriculture sector. This morning, we're going to be showcasing the work of the Sustainable Agricultural Landscape Lab at the University of British Columbia. You might already know some of these people, but I'm going to share an introduction to each of them. So we have DeLisa Lewis, who is the co-owner and operator of a diverse 40-acre farm in the Cowichan Valley. She's also a part-time teaching and research faculty member at UBC in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. She's closing in on 30 years of experience as a certified vegetable organic farmer and 17 years experience with soil health focused on farm research and field trials. Welcome, DeLisa. It's always great to have you for these sessions. We also have Sean Smukler, and he is the Associate Professor, Chair of Agriculture and Environment, and Director of the Center for Sustainable Food Systems in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at UBC. He also leads the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab. And this wasn't in your bio, Sean, but you're also the chair of the acre network. His research focuses on developing ways to help farmers adapt to climate change and improve the sustainability of their farming practices, specifically focusing on soils. And we also have Raelani Kesler. She is a research assistant with the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab, an instructor at UBC's Faculty of Land and Food Systems. She holds an MSc in soil science and has a background working and managing organic vegetable farms. So thank you guys. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Cell Lab is going to be sharing a few polls through our time together, and I'm going to be helping with that. Also, we'll be using, again, the Q&A box for questions. So I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with how that works by now, but you can use the Q&A box, and also that upvote feature will be available to you. So welcome to DeLisa, Sean, and Raelani. It's great to have you presenting this morning. And I'll hand things to you, Sean, to start things off.
Great, thanks so much, Shauna. Everyone see my screen? Perfect. Yeah, like Shauna, I'm joining from territory in the Coast Salish, the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm incredibly grateful for living and working in this region. I do want to point out that my co-presenters are joining from other territories, other traditional territories. And much of our work takes place in various regions of the province. And we want to recognize that we're incredibly grateful for working on those lands. And we try whenever possible to recognize that in our presentations and in our publications. And before I jump in, I do want to acknowledge that the work that we present today would not be possible without a number of key collaborators listed here. Some of them I'll introduce more further in the presentation. And then from funders, which includes My Tax, the Organic Science Cluster, the Ministry of Ag, the former Climate Action Initiative, and NSERC. So during this session, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to regenerative agriculture and its relationship to soil health, and specifically linking it to how we can address the climate crisis. And then Raelani is going to give us some highlights of 9 years of our field trial work. And then DeLisa is going to talk about some exciting next steps, a new project that we're launching and that we're hoping to reel in some producers on this Zoom to join us in addressing. So before we dive in, we'd like to get a sense of who's joining us. So we've got a couple of questions. So Shauna, yeah, if you could launch those polls, that would be great. We're just trying to get a sense of who's on the Zoom right now. Not that we're going to change what we present, but it will give us a better sense of how to cater the question and answer session. We've got 73 participants. That's awesome, and congratulations, Shauna and Asha, for I think record numbers for this ACARN workshop. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, we're just going to give one more minute, but it looks like we've got majority, well, a strong showing from producers and researchers. And then we've got one more to gauge where folks are joining from.
Those two questions were combined together there. And so you already have the results. I'm just sharing them.
Oh, I didn't see the scroll down. Got it. Perfect. So we've got a lot of people from the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. Great. So let's talk about regenerative agriculture and the link to soil health and the climate crisis. So there's lots of discussion, talk about regenerative agriculture. There is a renewed excitement, I think, about the role of agriculture, with regenerative playing a key part in the messaging of that. And while there are many definitions to regenerative agriculture, I really like this one, an approach to farming that uses soil conservation as the entry point to regenerate and to contribute to multiple ecosystem services. And I like this one because it centers what's happening on the soil, and two, because it recognizes that the soil is critical for providing many ecosystem services. These are the things that we as humans gain from ecological functions in the farming system, and it goes well beyond food production. So again, there are many definitions. One of the ways to define regenerative agriculture is often by principles, and so these are 5 principles that are often stated that together make for regenerative agriculture. So maintaining a living root system, minimizing the disturbance to soil, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, and integrating livestock. And while all of these aren't necessary to actually be regenerative, these are the principles that are often stated as critical. And then there's another way to define regenerative by the practices that are being implemented by the farmer. So these practices, again, can be numerous. I've seen lists of pretty much everything that farmers do listed as regenerative. But to me, these are the ones that seem most relevant to being regenerative. So conservation tillage, cover cropping, using complex rotations, using residue to mulch the soil, and to use integrated nutrient management and pest management in the operation, and adding organic amendments. But ultimately, the goal of regenerative agriculture is to build the soil and to improve the ecosystem services coming from that. And so we talk about soil health as a framework to evaluate the capacity of the soil to function, not just for food production, but for the ecosystem that sustains the plants and animals and humans that are in the ecosystem. So the key process that we're focused on when we're talking about regenerative agriculture is based on photosynthesis. Plants taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and translocating that carbon through their tissues to their roots, and then feeding the soil food ecosystem, and eventually building soil organic matter. 50% roughly of that soil organic matter is made up of that carbon that came originally from the atmosphere. And this is where the link to the climate crisis comes in. So when we think about healthy soils, we are hoping to ensure that they're regulating water. This helps water infiltrate. We are looking to sustain plant and animal life. We're trying to filter and buffer pollutants, cycle nutrients, provide physical and physical stability and support for the plants that we're trying to grow. So while it seems pretty straightforward to improve our soil health by adding organic matter or growing cover crops or all those practices that I just mentioned, there's actually a number of challenges that we need to recognize, particularly when we're talking about mixed vegetables. And many of these challenges actually are challenges that most farmers face. But whenever we're adding nitrogen to the system, or we're disturbing the soil, we're creating greenhouse gas emissions from that system. We're potentially leaching some of the nutrients from the system if we're not using them efficiently. And if we're not using them efficiently, particularly if we're adding a lot of phosphorus, and phosphorus is prominent in animal manures, we're building up a phosphorus pool that can be potentially environmentally problematic. And then there's the labor of getting the materials into the soil. And then there's access or cost of transport to get either the seed or the organic materials to the site. And then a recognition that there's places in the province, particularly here in the lower mainland, where our farmers are facing a limited land base. So let's focus for a minute on the idea of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, to help address the climate crisis. And what we're trying to do is to balance the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming in to the soil system with the amount that's coming out. And this is our net carbon sequestration. And while it sounds like it might be simple, it's actually challenging to get this net benefit and build our soil organic matter. We also have to recognize that if we're trying to have a positive impact on the climate, it's not just about the carbon dioxide, it's also about the methane being released from the system. And as I mentioned before, then the greenhouse gases that are coming from nitrogen application, which is nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that's nearly 300 times as powerful as carbon dioxide in terms of warming the planet. So we need to consider the net greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately try to build that soil organic matter. So over the last 9 years, since 2015, we've been doing on-farm research, and we started with a very simple experiment at the UBC farm led by a person who's a professor now, Gabriel Matias Landry, who looked at 4 different amendment options. And clearly highlighted that while we have lots of knowledge about the performance of compost and manures and the use of novel organic amendments, we don't have a very good grasp on the potential trade-offs. And what Gabriel illustrated from his research is that there are trade-offs between various soil health outcomes of practices that farmers across the province are using. So we recognize that these trade-offs need to be minimized and to try to focus on the practices that maximize the beneficial components of those various outcomes. So we followed up with a second set of trials that we did at UBC Farm and at Greenfire Farm, DeLisa's farm, and then on 19 farms around the province. And a postdoc, Kira Borden, worked on that, and Amy Norgard, as a master's student, worked on that. And that led to a third set of trials where we looked at overwintering covers, and Raelani, who will be talking in a minute, and Carson Lee, who I think is talking later today, looked at the interaction between winter covers and those different amendments. And now we're entering a fourth phase. This is a phase funded by the Organic Science Cluster. We'll be also looking at tillage, the impact of tillage and cover and soil amendments, and continuing to look at those trade-offs. So we are again trying to do some of these trials on farm with this mother-daughter farm design, where we've got 2 experimental farms with replicated treatments, and then on-farm field trials. So now I'm going to hand it over to Raelani now, who will talk about some of the highlights from those field trials before DeLisa talks more about the next steps.
Thanks, Sean. Building off of that introduction, I have results from 3 of those trials to share with you that focus on the nutrient amendment practices and then also soil cover, where we trialed the cover cropping and the tarping. So in the first trial, this is the organic vegetable nutrient management trial. And the purpose of this experiment was to evaluate nutrient management strategies to improve the nutrient balance, so the nutrient use efficiency of the crops, and also to see which strategies increased yield. And here we have 2 main treatments. So we trialed a high application of compost and then also compared it to a smaller application of compost with a little bit of fertilizer. Next slide, please. In this trial, we used a mother-daughter field trial approach. So we had 2 mother farms where we conducted more intensive experiments with on-farm replication of each of the treatments and more frequent sampling. And the first results that I'll share come from these 2 farms. So these are our mother farms. This is UBC Farm on the left and Greenfire Farm, DeLisa's farm in Duncan on the right. And we'll look at a map of the daughter design a little bit later on. So as I said, we have this high compost application and a low compost application plus nitrogen fertilizer. And the nitrogen fertilizer that we used was feather meal. And the reason that this comparison happens like this is because so nitrogen and phosphorus are both needed in large quantities by crops. But compost has a lot more phosphorus than it does nitrogen. So when we start with the objective of meeting the crop's requirement for the nutrients that are required for growth, if we target the amount of nitrogen it needs, we overapply phosphorus. So in this high compost scenario, what we're doing is saying the crop needs this amount of nitrogen. We're going to apply as much compost as needed to meet that nitrogen, knowing that phosphorus will be exceeded. And in the low compost plus fertilizer treatment, we're applying compost just to meet the phosphorus requirement of the crop, and then topping that up with the fertilizer to meet the nitrogen requirement. And both of these were compared with a control. If you click, you should see a photo of that, where we didn't apply any amendments. Next slide, please. So when we measured yield in these 2 years of this study, we found that the high compost had about 50% more yield than the control, where we didn't add any amendments. And the low compost plus the fertilizer had approximately 40% more yield, or an increase in yield. And then if you click again, we also saw that in the high compost scenario, while the yield was slightly higher, the results were way more variable. So the yield varied a lot from plot to plots, whereas in the low compost plus fertilizer plots, the yield was far more consistent. Next slide, please. So we also measured nutrient use efficiency, which tells us how much of what was applied was actually used by the crops. And we found that in the high compost treatment, 4 to 15% of the nitrogen was recovered by the crops, compared to the low compost plus N, where we saw a much higher proportion of that nitrogen being required. It was more 33 to 53%. And we also looked at phosphorus, and less than 5% of the phosphorus was recovered by the crops in that high compost application, whereas 20 to 64% was recovered by crops when we did the combination compost plus fertilizer. This trial also had a regional component. So these are the daughter farms that participated in the organic vegetable nutrient management project. And they were grouped into 3 regions: on Vancouver Island, in the Lower Mainland, in the Pemberton Valley. And on each of these farms, we tracked input costs for all of the compost and fertilizers that were used. And that's what we're seeing on this graph here. So on the y-axis, we have the input costs in kilograms per hectare. And then along the x-axis, you can see that each of the regions are grouped. So we have first the Fraser Valley, then the Pemberton Valley in the middle, and then Vancouver Island on the right. And the red box plots are the costs for the high compost treatment. The blue is the low compost plus fertilizer, and the yellow is typical. And that's just what the farmers were normally doing, how they would have amended their crops had we not been involved. And the main takeaways here are that the input costs were really variable across regions. So input costs were the lowest in the Fraser Valley for all of the treatment types, and much higher on Vancouver Island. And this is primarily driven by the cost of compost, which was significantly more expensive in places where it has to be trucked in, it has to come across the ferry in a lot of cases, and there's not the same animal agriculture industry to support the creation of compost. And you can see that trend holds even across just the typical treatments, and then in the high compost treatments as well. So the main takeaways from this trial is that with that low compost plus fertilizer treatment, we saw consistently higher yields than the control. High compost had a similar, if not slightly increased boost in yields, but with far more variability. We also saw that the low compost plus fertilizer had higher nutrient use efficiencies. So the plants were able to use a higher proportion of what we put down. But we're unsure about the long-term inputs on soil organic matter, because in that strategy, we're adding less carbon because we're adding less compost. We also saw that this approach, in terms of starting with what the crop needs and then applying to that point, was promising in terms of getting the crops what they needed and increasing yield. However, we also identified a few challenges and opportunities to improve that strategy. So in subsequent years, we've changed this approach to calculating what we'll add in terms of compost and fertilizer by first accounting for what's already in the soil and what will be contributed by the cover crops. So we've built a calculator to do that math before we apply any amendments in the spring. And we also saw that input costs were variable across regions, primarily driven by the compost costs, and that this would really change the accounting in terms of maybe what producers would be inclined to do based on what's accessible and what's affordable. So in the second study we're going to look at here, this is the winter soil management study, and we set out to evaluate winter soil cover strategies to determine their impact on spring soil water and soil nitrogen. And to do this, we looked at primarily two strategies. So the comparison of cropping and cover cropping, and also using silage tarps, which is what you can see in this picture here. And we also kind of had a third comparison, which was more of a winter fallow or really sparse cover crop on our regional farms. So this experiment was set up really similarly to the organic vegetable nutrient management trial in terms of experimental design, but we had some different farms and some different regions. So the mother farms are the same. It's Greenfire and UBC as well, and you can see those in red on the map. And then we had Vancouver Island, the Lower Fraser Valley, and Kootenay Mountains as our three regions. So this figure here is a depiction of spring soil nitrate. So soil nitrate is a plant available form of nitrogen that lives in the soil. And the treatments for this trial consisted of us putting down silage tarps and planting cover crops in the fall. And then in mid to late April, we went back to those fields and pulled the tarps off and took soil samples to measure the amount of nitrogen that was being held under the crops, under the tarps, and also left in the soil underneath the cover crops. And we'll walk through this together. There's a lot going on. But on the y-axis, we have the amount of nitrate in kilograms per hectare. And the graphs on the top here are from 2020, the spring of 2020, and then on the bottom, the spring of 2021. And then we have our farms separated out on the x-axis. So UBC and Greenfire have their own graphs, and then Kootenay Mountain, Lower Fraser Valley, and Vancouver Island are on the far right. And all of the black triangles are the tarped areas, or the areas that the tarp had just been removed. And then we have the cover crop or no tarp, kind of sparse cover crop plots in green. And what we're seeing here across the board is that there was more nitrate underneath the tarps than in the cover cropped areas. And in a lot of cases, this was an agronomically significant amount of nitrogen. So in the first year of this study, we grew beets and fennel. So I'm going to use beets as an example here, but the average nitrate level that we measured underneath the tarps represents about 70% of the recommended nitrogen application rate for a beet crop in BC. So this is it's a large amount of nitrogen. But it's important also to keep in mind that the amount of nitrate measured in the spring is relative to the fertility application of the previous growing season, and how much is left in the soil after harvest. So this varied farm to farm and region to region. This residual nitrate has important implications for spring fertility management and the crop's ability to use this nitrogen. So you could think about strategies like reducing the amount of time between tarping and planting so that crops would be better able to use this nitrogen before it gets washed away by the rain. Also, considerations like transplanting versus direct seeding would impact crops' ability to use this as well. We also measured soil water content. Next slide, please. At UBC Farm. And because UBC Farm is a mother farm and it's really close to campus, we were able to do a lot more intensive sampling here. So we measured volumetric water content about every 2 weeks over the course of the study. So I'm going to draw our attention to this middle graph here, graph B. And I know that this is quite small, but the middle graph is volumetric water content. And along the y-axis or the x-axis, those are all the months of the year. So this is the entire study starting in the fall of 2019 all the way through the fall of 2021. The areas that are shaded with gray are the times when the tarps or the cover crops were in the ground or on the ground. And then the white areas are the growing season. And so if we start kind of on the far left side, we see when the cover crops are planted and when the tarps are in place, the volumetric water content is about the same. Those dots are overlapping. And then after a few weeks, we see that the tarps have a lower water content, those black dots. So the tarps were keeping the ground drier over the winter, whereas the cover crop, which is, absorbing all of the rain from the winter months, is wetter. And that continues until we get to about early March, which you can see in the red box at the bottom there, and also circled with a red circle. In early March, we see that those lines cross, which means the tarps are staying about as wet as they have been all winter, but the cover crops are really starting to dry out. So at that point, spring is really coming on. It's a bit sunnier, it's a bit warmer. The cover crops are starting to put on growth and likely pulling water out of the soil through evapotranspiration as they're growing. And by the time we pulled those tarps off in mid-April, the tarps were actually keeping the ground wetter than the cover crops were. And this difference persisted for about 3 weeks. So there's a little pop-out graph you can see there. And here we see that for 3 weeks, the areas that had been previously tarped actually remained wetter. And we saw that trend again in the second year. About the same time, mid-March is when the lines cross and the tarps became wetter than the cover crops. And then that difference remained for about 3 weeks after the tarps were removed. This is really an important thing to think about here is UBC farm has really coarse textured soil. So the timing of tarp removal and the timing that maybe we would expect these soil water differences to switch would be dependent on region and on soil type. Next slide, please. So from this trial, we can take away that the tarps were effective at preserving nitrate over the winter, which is in an uncovered situation. Nitrate's really liable to leach out of the soil. It's really mobile. And we also noted that the timing of tarp removal was really important for soil water consideration. So depending on your management objective, you would want to remove tarps earlier or later, depending on if it's advantageous to keep that water in or if you want to evaporate it out. We also had a series of questions about the long-term impacts of these practices after we were done. So one disadvantage of using the tarps is there's no organic carbon addition to the soil because we're not growing cover crops, and it's unclear how that would impact soil carbon over the long term. We also measured yield in this study, but we didn't see a difference, but we also didn't account for any of the labor considerations that would be different between managing tarps and managing cover crops. And we know from some other work that's been done that we might expect to see differences. And then we also only use these tarps as soil cover tools, and they have a lot more applications. So folks are using them for weed suppression, for reduced tillage. And these are a lot of other important questions that weren't addressed in the study that could be addressed. Next slide, please. So the final trial I'm going to summarize here is one we conducted last summer. And we were looking to identify summer cover crop mixes for their contribution to soil nitrogen, weed suppression, and performance without irrigation. And we're interested in this because in our ongoing study, we want to incorporate a summer cover crop component as a part of our fertility management. And we're looking for good species or mixes of species that would perform well in the time that we had. So we chose 3 types of cover crops. We have oats, peas, and fava beans. And we had 6 different treatments in this trial. So we did a mix of all 3 where we had oats, peas, and favas. And then we had a couple of 2 species mixes. So oats and peas, oats and favas, peas and favas. And then we also trialed just peas and just fava beans. Next slide, please. And in this trial, we conducted this on 3 farms. So it's more of a pilot study, but we had, again, UBC farm, Greenfire farm, and then also Amara farm in Courtney. And we planted these summer cover crops in late May and came back to terminate them and harvest the biomass in late July, early August. Next slide, please. So one thing that we measured was the amount of total biomass that the cover crops put on during this time. And we trialed each of the mixes under irrigated and non-irrigated conditions. And we found that on average, if you irrigate the cover crop, it puts on about twice the amount of biomass if it's unirrigated. However, there's still a really significant amount of biomass in the unirrigated trial. So it was about 17,000 pounds per acre. And so we can see that in the blue dots here, those are all of our irrigated plots for each of our species mixes, and the gray triangles were unirrigated. And the graph on the far right, it's Amara Farm. The points are much closer together, and a lot of you might remember last summer, there's a lot of water shortages. And so we were unable to irrigate the irrigated plots at this farm really consistently, and that's why you see less of a difference there. Another thing we noted is that we tracked the maturation timing of the cover crop species, and because we know that there's a certain point in the growth stage that's most advantageous to terminate them if we want to optimize the amount of nitrogen that's going to mineralize out of them. And we didn't see a difference in that mineralization time or in the maturation timing of the cover crops, whether or not they were irrigated or unirrigated. They all kind of matured at about the same time. We also measured the amount of weed biomass in these plots because one of the objectives of cover cropping is to suppress weeds. And here we see that, again, irrigation generally grew more weeds than unirrigated plots, and that the oats were pretty important for weed suppression. So in the just peas, or sorry, fava and peas and just favas alone, we saw overall more weeds than the mixes that included oats. The peas did pretty well just by themselves. It's also important to note that the seeding rate was the same for irrigated and unirrigated, so we could compare them directly, but practically it might make sense to increase the seeding rate in unirrigated applications. And also we can see here that the fava beans generally had quite a bit more weed biomass than the other plots, and they also had a lower overall cover crop biomass. And we used a pretty conservative seeding rate, and the low performance of the fava beans was definitely because that seeding rate was likely too low. Final slide, please. So here, we see that even when not irrigated, the summer cover crops can produce a pretty significant amount of biomass that potentially represents an important contribution of nitrogen to the soil after they're tilled in. And from this trial, the peas and the oat pea mix were our favorite for a short season cover. They're definitely the most cost effective for their weed suppression and total biomass benefits. And if we were to do this again, we would definitely increase that fava seeding rate to get kind of a better data set by 3 times, like pretty significantly. And we have the biomass, but we don't yet have the data for these cover crops to test their carbon and nitrogen content, which will tell us what that potential nitrogen contribution is to the soil. But just from the observations, we know that we would have needed to terminate those cover crops earlier for maximum contribution. They were already fairly mature by the time that late July rolled around. So definitely heavier on the carbon than the nitrogen. And then one more. And we also have an upcoming comparison where we'll compare these growing season covers to a year-long cover that we'll have results for at some point later this year. I know that was a lot of information.
Thank you so much, Raelani. You have generated a lot of questions, and we have almost 100 people here tuned in to listen. Yes, and you're getting applause. Do you see them floating up there?
Yes,
Great. Okay, so for the questions, I'm going to go back to the first trial you talked about, the one with compost and versus high compost versus low compost plus N. So a key question there is around what kind of compost did you use in those trials? And if it varied by region, could you just speak to that? The comments are around phosphorus buildup if you're using animal manures, and also just curiosity because different regions, have different kind of compost available.
Yeah, Sean, was it still Earth Bank and Net Zero in that trial?
In the first trial, it was what was locally available. So in some cases, we were using on-farm compost, places that were making their own compost we used. And then in other places where they were purchasing compost, we used the purchased compost that was most local.
So could you just speak to what the composition of that might be? And
Yeah, I mean, the composition varied quite dramatically, and we actually have a fact sheet that highlights the differences of those composts that we can share with everybody. It's sorry, thanks, Jeff. Uh, yeah, this fact sheet will highlight the differences in the compost across the different regions, and they varied enormously in terms of their carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus ratios. So in some cases, the N to P ratio was a lot higher than the crop demand, and then in other cases, it was closer.
okay, thank you for that. And we will pop the link to that fact sheet into the chat here in a moment. Okay, so another compost question. So instead of looking simply at the cost of compost amendment, did you also look at the contribution margin? So that would mean looking at the costs, all the direct expenses in relation to the gross revenues. And the question is coming up because if compost over time increases yield and changes other expenses, maybe that single year cost becomes less significant.
Yeah, we did not look at that except for at UBC Farm. We didn't ask farmers for the details on their economics. But that's a really great point and something that we want to dig deeper into.
Okay, great. So now we're going to go to a couple of TARP questions. All right. Where am I going to start on the TARPs here? Okay. So I'm sure this is something you've, maybe I'll bundle a couple things together. So one is just around the environmental cost of the plastic of the tarps. I know that's a question you guys have had. So if you could speak to that. And then if you could also just speak to extreme weather events and using the tarps, and if there's any kind of relationship or what the context would be, if there's flooding or if there's drought conditions. So if you don't mind tackling both of those together, that'd be great.
Yeah, the plastic piece came up a lot when we were talking to producers about using this practice. About half the farms in the trial were already using tarps and the other half were not using tarps. We weren't accounting for it in any sort of metric sense. I don't know if anyone has done a life cycle analysis of the tarps versus like tillage or some other practice. Like, I don't know how that math shakes out. What was the second part of that question? Which did you
Yeah,
bundle?
the extreme weather events like flooding and drought.
Yeah, I can't imagine that a tarp would be useful in a flooding event. Like, I think that this is folks were choosing the areas that they wanted to tarp on these farms more for areas that either had a late season crop and so they couldn't get a cover crop in there in time, or that they wanted to get on the ground quite early. And so they didn't think that the soil moisture conditions would be great to turn in a cover crop. So they were more thinking about like the seasonal soil water conditions rather than extreme weather events. And I know I see Aaron and Johnny are here. They were one of the farms in the trial that were already using tarps and were using them in season to actually keep water in. So they had a very sandy soil and were irrigating under the tarps, I believe. You two can correct me in the chat if I'm getting any of these details wrong. But in the growing season, using the tarps to hold water in until they could actually plant. So using these tarps on kind of like the flip side.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to want to make sure there's time to also talk about the next round of trials that you guys are going to have. But I'm going to ask one more question. Hopefully that will tie in. Burning question, will drier regions such as the Caribou be included in future trials. And so, of course, for all of those that are more inland, where they're already experiencing drier conditions and climate change will be making it even drier, they really want to know if you could be expanding the trials up there.
We don't
And
have.
Sean, if you don't mind to just maybe speak up and lean in a little bit too. Thank you.
Sorry about my ancient technology here. Yeah, we don't have a plan to do trials in the Caribou in this coming round, but we will be working in the Okanagan, which will be substantially drier than the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. So hopefully there's some analogous conditions.
Okay, great. So there's a lot of great questions in the Q&A, and I can see Raelani is already typing some answers in there. So thanks for that. And if there are questions we don't get to, we will be sending them to our speakers this morning. They can answer them by email, and then we'll send out those answers to you all. So we will get to all the questions. So now I'm going to hand things to DeLisa. So thanks, DeLisa. I see you're already.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I close enough to the mic? My standing desk requires that I move around a little bit anyway, so get used to that. Thank you so much, Raelani and Sean. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And as part of continuing with our long-term research that's focusing on soil health and supporting farmer adaptation to climate emergencies and weather extremes, on-farm field research that spans as many different growing seasons and as many different regional contexts as we can reach. That's what we feel is our best opportunity to address and to better understand the variation and dynamics, particularly with soil carbon and soil organic matter that we've been talking about here today. So upcoming regional on-farm and field research that will continue alongside with these long-term research field work we've been sharing with you today at UBC Farm, Greenfire Farm, and dozens of other regional farms and farmers. We want to address these questions such as how does reduced tillage impact soil health, and how does nitrogen fixed on site through the summer and winter, how would that impact yields and profits? And thanks again, Jeff and others who've asked really good questions to help us consider those costs in a more comprehensive way. We will also be asking questions around what's the combination of these regenerative practices Sean was talking about at the top here, specifically to try and maximize soil carbon sequestration. How do these practices impact profit? And as Sean just mentioned, the regions that we're looking at for the upcoming trials are Vancouver Island, Lower Mainland, and the Okanagan. Just a quick plug for how dry the Vancouver Island and Islands region is during the growing season. We are quite dry. So next slide, please, Sean. And just to speak quickly to the research design, Raelani walked you through great examples of how we were looking at that in previous studies. So the practice of tillage and the idea of reducing tillage is one of the potential research treatments we're talking about, as well as the targeted nutrient management. And just like that trial we conducted with Amy Norgard and Kira Borden and others leading that, we'll be looking at farmers' typical approach, or could be called business as usual, gleaning from farmer participants how they manage nutrients in their given growing region. We also want to be looking at, as Raelani mentioned, building on that pilot project of summer cover crops, composting, and feather meal combinations, targeting nutrient management applications around those kinds of research questions, and looking at these different locations. 5 farms, hopefully per region, and each one of those farms doing one replication at the research plot level. So let's look at now the role of collaborating farmers. So what we've outlined here is best we see it. The regional farmers who would like to collaborate with us on this upcoming research to learn more about soil health dynamics in the context of their unique farming systems, as well as in the context of those growing regions. And so in terms of what we hope to provide as benefits for farmers who are interested and able to participate with us, we'll be offering that sampling and those lab reports of nutrient analysis, that information each spring. The seed for summer and winter cover crops for research plot areas that would be on participating farms. Also the sampling analysis of crop yields and crop nutrient content at those research plots at the farm the research plots on participating farmers' farms. Lots to say, so many syllables. So also what we'll be offering in terms of a benefit would be that nutrient management plan. And Raelani alluded to this. We've been working on building a nutrient management calculator and some tools. We'll be providing training and opportunities for farmer participants to continue create their own nutrient management plans going forward using those tools. That would be a great outcome. And finally, that opportunity at the end of the research project to share lessons learned with other participating farmers and researchers way out there in 2028. It'll come faster than we think. On the left-hand side of this slide is the ask. What will we be asking participating farmers to contribute? And to begin with, dedicating a small field area, and ideally for all 4 years of this upcoming research. We'll be asking that participating farmers, in order to set up that nutrient management plan, that they share that management information, and to help us learn more about adoption of specific soil nutrient management practices on farms. We'll be asking for your insights on whether or not you adopt these practices within your farming system. We'll be asking participating farmers also to contribute in helping set up the trial, basically establishing the beds and planting the same single harvest crop across all of the research treatments within their plots. Raelani's already mentioned several examples of what we mean by single harvest crops. The beets and fennel, that sort of rotation at the mother farms came in when Raelani joined us with the overwintering tarp design. So beets and fennel are both examples. And in fact, our rotations in the long-term experiments, we're coming back to those crops at UBC Farm and at Greenfire Farm this year in our targeted nutrient management. So that's an example. We've also grown potatoes. There are a few others like cabbage. The purpose of that single harvest crop is to aid with simplifying for us that harvest and yield sampling and the ability of the researchers to get in and out without much disturbance on the farm. So that helps us a great deal, just facilitate the research, do that yield measurement. And we will be adding, as I mentioned, this nutrient content measurement as well going forward. So I'm excited about that piece, particularly as a contribution to organic vegetable farmers more broadly. All right, so next slide, Sean. So connecting with the results that Raelani shared about the differences in nutrient management strategies kind of across the regional farming systems we've been exploring. Note that as far as our guiding principles within agroecology, we follow this as an approach to learning on farms. And so note that all of this research and our approach is meant to be contextualized and relevant and targeted You've heard so much about that already today. So what we aim to do is to collaborate with an interdisciplinary group of researchers and a really wide range of farmers across differing growing regions, all the way around the province as best we can. And at all points, what we're seeking, you've heard a bit about this today as well, we're seeking efficiencies. Sean talked about trade-offs, but we're seeking efficiencies with farm productivity and profitability that are matched with ecological and social outcomes. Great example of that was the low compost and nitrogen treatment that Raelani touched on. We were learning early in the game with the work of Dr. Gabriel Landre that those trade-offs are a significant part of what we need to better understand. And so over time, we are fine-tuning this and seeking efficiencies for farmers as well as for these ecological and social outcomes. So next slide, Sean. On this slide sort of at the center, hopefully you can see what is an idealized version of the research process. We've been talking about results and the background, but we're currently in this mode of building partnerships and designing that research for the upcoming 2024 all the way to 2028 growing seasons. So this is what's indicated here as a kind of a choice point. It's a choice point in the research process. And in other words, we're inviting farmer partnerships and others and the input on the design sort of before we sort of spiral and begin into those next steps of collecting information, of analyzing, sharing it back, and then reforming, building and strengthening those partnerships. So that is meant to show you that along the way, and again, in ideal terms, we're learning as we go, that we'll be consulting, involving, and collaborating with participating farmers, and ideally generating these actionable research outputs that both informs and empowers all of our participants. So let's go to the next slide, and it really is meant to be now an interactive set of questions to engage you all. Shauna, are we on the same page with respect to those polls and this question? So thinking about what are the main challenges for nutrient management in organic vegetable farms.
All right, we've got it up there for you, DeLisa.
Awesome, great.
But we will have to wrap up in just a moment, so this will be the last hurrah here.
Okay, this is it.
Yeah, but people can hop up there now and fill out the poll. There's 4
Great.
questions there for them.
Thanks. Lots of time for questions as usual.
Sean, maybe while folks are filling out the poll, do you want to show the last slide that has my email on it in case?
Yep, good time to, as we're inviting this participation, link you all to that person who's going to accept your invitation. Thanks so much, Raelani.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, this is a fine note to end on. Raelani has been madly typing answers to many of the questions that came out about the earlier phases of the research. And DeLisa, I'm glad you had a chance to go into detail about what's coming up. I just have to say, like, kudos to you and your team for extending this multi-year, we will soon have over a decade of this research going on that's supporting organic vegetable growers. And it's amazing to just see the layering of questions, and so many of the questions that came up in the chat are actually going to be addressed in this new phase of research. So very well placed, right? Obviously, you're listening to the concerns of growers, and as a grower yourself, you know what questions people want to have answered.